Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of JP's Misadventures. In today's episode, I'm going to tell you about when I used to provide telephone support for Samsung as well as Time Warner Cable. As a Tier 2 and Tier 3 technical support agent, I got some fairly interesting calls. The first one I'm going to tell you about is when I worked for Samsung and I was providing technical support for their printers, copiers, and faxes. The lady who called in claimed to be a network administrator, and she could not get one of our wireless printers to work. And of course, I went through all the possible different uh, things that could be wrong and finally determined that she had a power problem. So I asked her if the outlet that it was plugged into was energized, if we could possibly plug something else into that electrical outlet to determine if that electrical outlet actually worked. And she looked, I say she looked at me, and she said to me, "Sir, it's wireless. I told you I was a network administrator and that this was a wireless printer." And I said, "Yes, ma'am. You told me you were a network administrator, but apparently you also need to be an electrical engineer to understand that it has to be plugged into power in order for the wireless transmission of data to it. You'll please plug it into an electrical outlet. I'm sure it will work fine." And of course, it did. The next little scenario that happened to me, I had a Time Warner Cable customer call in and swear up and down that we were spying on her. And I investigated a little further with some more questions, and it turns out she had seen on the front of the actual cable box the little infrared eye that picks up the signal from the remote control. And she swore up and down that it was a camera. Well, in a way it is, but not a video camera. It is simply an infrared sensor that picks up the flashes of light from the remote control. And of course, I proved this to her with a small piece of masking tape that we placed over the front of it and proved to her that no, it only sees the remote control. Well, after satisfactorily taking care of this and getting ready to get off the call, as a joke, I simply said something I should not have. And I said, "By the way, that's an awfully nice green dress you're wearing today." How did I know she was wearing a green dress? I didn't. I just was making a snarky remark. But unfortunately, she was wearing a green dress. And this led to another hour of me explaining that no, I was simply being a smartass and that I could not see her. And lots and lots of apologies, plus a $50 credit on her bill. Uh, that one really got me. And last, I had a customer, and although I won't use her name to protect her anonymity, let's just call her Miss Paris. Miss Paris called in and swore up and down that one of our techs who had been to her home was stalking her. And I took her totally seriously and was just kind of rather appalled, and basically explained to her that, she needed to file a police report and everything and give them, the evidence of his stalking and everything. And about, probably 3 minutes into this call, one of the guys that had been around for a long time leaned over and put my phone on mute. And he says, "Dude," he says, "is that Miss Paris?" And I shook my head, yes. He says, "You might want to read the notes first." Well, I did start reading the notes, and Miss Paris had pages and pages and pages of notes. And this was just from that day. About 10 pages in, I realized that no, Miss London didn't have a stalker. Miss London was one of our more special customers. But then Miss Pierce went on to say that she was having a problem. She could not get her cable to show on her television. And after a few questions, I determined that she was simply on the wrong source on her television. And once we got the television on the correct source, we ran into another problem. And this one is particular, and some of y'all may know this, but some cable companies have all-in-one remotes that allow you to control your television as well as your cable box once they're programmed to it. And they have a button at the top that says all power on, which of course powers the cable box on, then powers the TV on. And of course, if you have a home theater system, powers it on as well. Well, she would hit that button, and of course it'd turn her cable box on, but then she'd set down the remote in such a way that the signal would not turn her television on. So the cable box is on, but the television isn't. So she'd hit the button again, this time making sure to leave it pointing in the correct direction. But of course, because the cable box was on, now it turns the cable box off and turns the television on. So you see the problem here. It gets out of sync. Well, after about 15-20 minutes of finally getting that straightened out, she ended up on the wrong source again. So eventually I was able to get her taken care of. The whole call took me the better part of 45 minutes, which with a Miss Paris call was actually pretty short. Well, Miss Paris got hung up on a lot. Miss Paris's favorite thing to do when she got off work every day was go home, drink a fifth of tequila, and then call us. And of course, she would absolutely berate whoever she was speaking with. She would tell them how stupid they were and that they didn't know what they were doing and how the hell did they ever get a job here. And no one could seem to help her. It always, ended up usually with someone doing the unthinkable. In the call center biz, that's called hooking a call. In other words, hanging up. Anyway, I got to be known kind of as the person who could handle her. And that's because I always remained professional and didn't let her little barbs and horrible sayings get to me. And eventually one night, after helping her actually fix her problem, I told her, I said, look, Miss Pierce, the next time you have a problem, when you call in, pretend you have a digital phone. I know you don't, but just pretend you do for the computer. That'll put you into my department. Once you're actually speaking to a live agent, ask to be transferred to my extension. This is my extension. And I gave out my extension number. Well, my supervisor at the end of the road was listening in on the call, and he absolutely had a conniption fit. He says, you never, ever do that. And I said, yeah, but she gets hung up on a lot, and I am able to help her and fairly quickly. So, just let it alone. I'll take care of her. So it got to be known around the call center of 500 people, by the way, that I could handle Miss Pierce. So they all learned my extension, and when they accidentally got Miss Pierce, they always transfer her to me. And it didn't matter if I had a customer on the line or not, I'd always take her call. And it got to where I could usually handle her calls in under 15 minutes. Even though she was drunk and even though she was really too inebriated to operate the equipment, I could usually take care of it. Well, one night, after taking care of her problem, she accused me of falling for her, so to speak. And I don't know if Miss Paris was just lonely or what the deal was, but she basically accused me of stalking her. And I told her, no, ma'am, that wasn't me. And she's so, yeah. And just how am I to know that? And I told her, I said, well, I really don't think my husband would appreciate that. Now, Miss Paris was known for, like I said, berating people and never, ever shutting up. And she shut up for a whole 50 seconds. She didn't say a word. And my supervisor was listening in, and he stood up and he says, I don't believe it. He shut up Miss Paris. And immediately people started standing up and leaning over their cubes and mumbling, he shut up Miss Paris. He shut up Miss Paris. How did he shut up Miss Paris? Miss Paris never stops talking. And of course, I just kind of laughed and giggled and everything and thanked her for her business and told her, to please have a nice evening and that I would probably speak to her again tomorrow. And sure enough, I did speak to her the next day. It was a Friday. And when she called in, Miss Pierce was unusually inebriated. Now, normally, yeah, she was a mean drunk, but this night she was not only a mean drunk, she was slurring her words, and it was very hard for me to understand her. And I attempted for 20 minutes to get her onto the correct source, and both her television and her cable box turned on at the same time. But it just wasn't happening, no matter how hard we tried. And eventually, I told her, I said, I'm sorry, Miss Pierce. We've tried and tried and tried. But apparently this evening, you are too inebriated to operate the equipment. And she screamed at me. She says, are you calling me a drunk? And I said, no, ma'am. You're the one that calls yourself that. I simply said, it's time for you to go to bed, and I will speak to you tomorrow. She actually said thank you and hung up. And I thought that would be the end of it. The following day, I was off, and I had to run to Office Depot or Office Max, one of those, to pick up a wireless router for another customer of mine, not a cable customer, but I also ran a small business where I installed computer equipment and software and those types of things. And while I was there, I noticed this one particular printer was on sale for a really good price. And actually took a picture of it with my phone because I couldn't believe how good the price was. And then I heard her, Miss Paris, at the front of the store, screaming at a poor little cashier. And I walked up. I said, Miss Paris, what seems to be the problem here? And she immediately turned around because she recognized my voice. She said, Jason? And I said, yes, Miss Pierce. She says, well, they have this printer and it's on sale back here, but this kid keeps ringing it up at the wrong price. And I said, well, let me take a look. And I looked, and of course it was the one that was on sale. And I explained to the young man, yes, sir, that one is on sale. And here's a picture of the tag that y'all have on it. I said, if you'll do me a favor, simply go and get your manager so that this sale can be voided and so that he can put in the proper price. And he left, and she thanked me. And of course, the manager came back and he apologized and took care of everything. And we got outside, and Miss Paris thanked me for my help and everything. And understand, she was not inebriated at this time. She was, however, a real estate broker. She ran a real estate office with many, many agents underneath her that she owned. And she just couldn't thank me enough and asked me why I always put up with her. And I told her, I said, well, we always get frustrated. Everybody gets frustrated. And your frustrations are not unlike anybody else's. However, you're a hard customer to handle. And I'm good at taking care of your needs when other people that I work with simply cannot handle your abrasiveness. And she said, well, I really appreciate that. And I said, I'm glad you appreciate it, because if I were to show up at your place of business as inebriated as you are when you show up at mine, you'd have me arrested. I want you to think about that real long and hard, because you're actually on a list at Time Warner Cable to not become a customer, which means if they have any more trouble out of you, you're going to be let go as a customer and not allowed to be a Time Warner Cable customer ever again. And I said, I'm the only thing standing between that and you. And so I would appreciate it if perhaps the next time you call me with a problem, that you've drank a little less, not a little more, as you always seem to do. You know my hours. You know what days I work. You know my extension. If you ever have any problems, you call me and I'll help you take care of them. About 3 weeks later, I heard from Miss Pierce, which is unusual. I hadn't heard from her in a while. And when I did hear from her, she simply wanted to say thank you, that she'd gotten into a program and was going to meetings and was now sober. And I like to think that I'm the one that made the difference in her life, but it was all her. She's the one that had to take that first step. I was simply showed her the door. And I'm glad that she took it. Not everybody does. You can put people in rehab all day long, but unless they want to be there, it's not going to take. And that was kind of a theme in one of my favorite television shows that I've been watching lately called Matlock. I don't know if any of y'all have seen it, but it's a good show. You ought to check it out. Well, those are my little stories from my call center days. It was one of those jobs that I really enjoyed. I always did well at it, and I hope you enjoyed it.